Pride readers, welcome to Pride Book Fest. I'm Rosie Talbot. My pronouns are she and her. I am a bookstagrammer, a bookseller, and an aspiring author, and I am so excited to bring you queer-coded monsters, villains, and machines. Today, we're going to talk about how villains, monsters, and machines have often been queer-coded, and we're going to be chatting with 5 authors who are reclaiming these narratives and characters and writing fresh, powerful versions for new generations. But what is queer coding? Well, put simply, it's when writers and other creators give characters stereotypically queer traits to heavily imply that they are LGBTQIA+ without openly saying so. This was often because there was either a code in place, such as the Hollywood Hays Code, which prevented the positive and open representation of queer people on screen, or more recently, because they simply didn't think their show, movie, or book would be aired if it featured openly queer characters because of societal views at the time. Needless to say, times have thankfully changed, and we have welcomed a plethora of openly queer characters to our shelves in recent years, with many more about to debut. So, without further ado, let's meet our panelists.
I guess I will go first. I'm H.E. Edgman. My pronouns are he and they. I am a YA author who writes stories about magic and monsters that are actually just very thinly veiled allegories about anti-fascism. And my debut, The Witch King, will actually be out by the time this airs, which is not at all anxiety-inducing.
I guess I'm next. I'm Jessica, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm a YA and middle grade author. My middle grades are under the name Jazz Taylor. My first YA, Bad Witch Burning, will be out August 24th, and my second YA, Monster, which is what I'll be talking about here, obviously, is going to be out in 2022.
Hi, I'm Zoe Hana Makuda, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the debut author of Gearbreakers, which is an upcoming YA sci-fi about queer Korean girls hunting down 200-foot mecha deities in the desert and falling in love.
A tale as old as time. I'll go next. Hi, I'm Caleb Rarig. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the author of a number of queer thrillers, including the most recently, The Fell of Dark. I don't have a copy of the book with me, but I have this printout, an A4 size paper of the cover. The Fell of Dark is a story about a teenage disaster gay living in the Chicago suburbs who learns that he is identified in an ancient prophecy about the vampire apocalypse. He just doesn't know if he is meant to bring in the end of the world or prevent it.
Here I am. I am Adam Sass, and pronouns he, him. I am my YA debut, Surrender Your Sons. I have an arc, so all of my hardcovers are downstairs. Was last fall. It's a YA thriller about a group of queer kids who overthrow a conversion therapy camp on a mysterious island. My second book, The 99 Boyfriends of Micah Summers, is coming out next fall, and it is a romantic comedy that is a Cinderella retelling from the prince's point of view. So we get some of those running around trying to find someone shenanigans. So totally opposite books, but really connected by, I guess, humor and heart are sort of my things. There are a lot of character stuff, and even the thriller has lots of dark comedy in it. So regardless of if it's just a comedy or if it's a scary comedy, you will enjoy yourself.
Wonderful. Welcome, everybody. I know we have a lot to discuss, so let's dive straight in to our first question. From cold-blooded but effeminate Hades to Scar's limp wrist to Mrs. Trunchbull, whose nonconformist butchness and sporting prowess were used to emphasize her nastiness, the association of villains with stereotypically queer traits in children's media and beyond has led to the perpetuation of harmful stereotypes and associations. What impact has the history of queer-coded villains had on you as a writer and on your approach to character creation and expression?
So, one thing that I want to say is I think that when you look at a lot of queer villains or queer-coded villains, they're not usually even necessarily evil, like in the typical evil sense. What they are is selfish, and their goals are at odds with the protagonist. And I actually think, like, if you think about heteronormativity as being the protagonist, like, queer people are at odds with the protagonist by nature, and wanting to be recognized and validated, like, authentically as ourselves is seen as selfish by people who would rather we not. So I think that something that I really enjoy doing when I'm writing, even like my main characters who are canonically like on page queer characters, is thinking about how from another perspective in the story, they just are the villain. They are the queer villain.
Yeah, definitely that queer-coded villain of popular media is something to overcome, which is what more queer authors in the market these days. Just because that queerness previously seen as like is a very superficial thing on these villains. Like they're written, like their queerness is written as a superficial thing. It's just about writing characters in a nuanced way where the queer traits aren't directly associated with evil, because of course there should be queer villains as much as queer heroes. The one thing you could do is like have queer people on both sides, just queer people everywhere, and then it's not associated with one side, and it's fantastic. You can even have the queer traits of the villain work to humanize them, like putting in like some kind of romantic arc or like having it contribute to their history.
Yeah, I mean, I'll second that. My debut is it's a queer ensemble. There's a dozen queer heroes versus a group of mixed queer villains and straight villains. So I mean, I think like for me growing up, like the stuff that hurt more than like a queer villain did was invisibility or the characters meaningless to the story in any way. So maybe this is the performer in me coming from a performing background, but being like, oh no, they were just more fun. They would be more fun to play. Like, so I mean, I definitely, even if the villain was just queer coded, I never minded that as much as seeing no one around. So I think for me, yeah, as Zoe said, like, yeah, just bring it in, bring more everybody in. I think when that's like your only presence in the story, that's when it becomes extremely weighted in the negative. But just more of us.
I think it's actually to dovetail on that. An interesting point is that for a long time, villains were the only queer characters that had any power in a story. If a queer person had any strength at all, they were almost inevitably some sort of a villain in the piece. And being able to see portrayals of queer power was very it was rare, but it was exciting for me too. So yeah, you do kind of, as a kid, you start identifying with some of the villains. And I think for me as an adult, that influence, when we talk about what kind of an influence queer coding had on us as like creatively, I wanted to start writing queer heroes who were strong, who still got to control the story. Because I think something that persists now, it's less of a problem than it was maybe 5 years ago, but a lot of readers still see, if your character is queer, that's the plot, that's the story, and that's what all the action should revolve around, is their queerness and how their identity, is integrated or not integrated with the world around them. And what I love about horror and thrillers and these, kind of genre fiction pieces is that we get to see queer people just living their lives and doing all the things that straight kids do, just backwards and in heels.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. I was just gonna say that when I was little, I always related to the villains because they had more relatable reasons to do what they were doing. So if we look at like the Lion King or something like that, I don't know how it feels to run a kingdom, but I do know how it feels to be the black sheep of a family. And so to me, that taught me when I am personally writing villains, I should always give them a relatable um, something to that readers can connect to, like a human reason to do what they do, whether they're queer or not.
Wonderful. Thank you. And actually tying into that, my favorite villain, particularly Disney villain when I was growing up, was Ursula from The Little Mermaid, because she was this ferocious witch queen who had a thriving business. She was self-employed. A king was scared of her, and she could put lipstick on underwater. She was brilliant. And despite all of her villainy, there was just something about that bold defiance that sort of 10-year-old me just really admired. So is there a particularly queer-coded villain from books, TVs, movies, comics that really left a lasting positive impact on you when you were growing up?
I'll take that. I would say for me, this is not really Disney, but I would say in Batman, I would say would be the Riddler for some reason. Always kind of stuck with me because, and this is another kind of reason why I tend to write queerness not just in heroes but in villains, is that I'm also interested in, let's explore some of the negative aspects of what being in the closet can do to a person, or fill in the blank. And I think the Riddler really exemplifies a type of queer person that I identify with a lot, which is to a very unhealthy degree needing to prove that you're the smartest one in the room, and to really over pronounce yourself to the point where that just becomes your life, where you're just really obsessed with everyone recognizing you. So that's definitely a villain that touched me early on, and continues.
I found actually all the Disney villainesses I think spoke to me in some way, because they were also fabulous and dramatic, and I think particularly Medusa from The Adventurers. She's one that people don't really talk about as much, but she was emotionally unstable. She couldn't drive. She was obsessed with shiny things. I'm I can relate to that. That's somebody after my own heart. And another character, and this is going to be a really weird answer, but Norman Bates was also made a huge impression on me, because even before the twist in the story of Psycho, he's a really compelling character. And even though he is, textually he's obsessed with Marion Crane, he's obsessed with women, there is still something very queer about his persona, not just because he's played by Anthony Perkins, who is a queer man, but there is something about his shyness, his awkwardness, his kind of limited social skills. His best friend is his mother. He's a voyeur, which is not queer specifically, but I always felt voyeuristic as a teenager, because I felt like I was always on the outside, trying to look in, trying to see other people living these lives that I couldn't quite relate to, because everything seemed to come easily to them. And I feel like you see a lot of that in what's his name, Norman Bates.
I would put up Eris from Sinbad, that animated movie. Oh my gosh, what is the full name of it? I have no idea. But I would say that she's kind of sapphic coded, because I don't know, there's just always, I felt empty flirting toward men to have the world in the palm of her hand. That was something I thought was just neat. I felt like she had a real sense of self. That kind of just stayed really consistent, even though her plan is foiled by the end. But for some reason, I might be biased just because I thought she was attractive as a tiny child, and I didn't know what that meant yet. But I just thought she was, I don't know, just that confidence is something I think I carry with me, or try to carry with me.
I absolutely wanted to be Captain Hook when I was a kid. I think that there is something about the entire pirate life that feels inherently queer. I think it's the sort of, there's probably lots of aspects to it, but there's definitely found family sort of aspect to it. And he was fashionable, and he was exhausted of these irritating children, and I wanted to be him so very badly.
Jess, I don't know if you have an answer for your favorite queer-coded villain that had a positive impact on you.
Yes, sorry, my internet went out, so I wasn't sure if it was my turn.
It is your turn indeed.
Yes, this is kind of cheating, but Cusco from Emperor's New Groove. I know he's the protagonist, but he's also like his own worst enemy. So I think that was the very first time I saw an unlikable protagonist. And so that just really stuck with me because that's all I want to write now. It's just somebody who's like the worst, and then eventually he gets better at the end. But yeah, he's definitely my favorite.
I love him too.
I love that. I love a good unlikable protagonist, especially like in queer books, because what makes someone unlikable in terms of like queer main characters is usually like, this person is difficult for me to digest, and like sometimes queer characters should be difficult for people to digest. Like
That's a very long overdue conversation. We don't talk about the fact that we don't let queer people be complicated or prickly, or like, there is so much pressure on queer characters and on queer creators to write these like model very like idealized role model characters, and that's just not life. And those people aren't realistic, and quite frankly, yeah, like the closet will mess you up. Like, being like, queer phobia will mess you up, and it will make you do certain things that are unlikable or that can be perceived as unlikable. So what you were saying previously about, if you consider heterosexuality to be the protagonist, then anything that goes against heteronormativity is going to be seen as some kind of like subversive, potentially unlikable behavior.
And to that, I will say, and I will confess something that I don't usually confess to, but like the book that helped me the most when I was coming out of the closet is The Rules of Attraction by Bret Easton Ellis. So like super problematic author. I don't like wash my hands of now, but there was, because of that book, because it was so full of queer characters and queerness, and it was just really messy. It was about, you know, being with some guy and then he pretends doesn't know you, but he's still with you. Like, there was just all of this stuff that, you know, and it was something about the real, like the edges to that made it more real, and that grounded it in it. And it was not a coming out book. There was no, my parents can't accept it. Like, there was none of that. It was just I'm living my life, and it felt there was a oh, I understand this. I see this. These are all my heterosexual friends. It's just happening, and I can be included in this way. So that was like a weirdly confirming thing for me. So I do always prickle a little bit when, okay, as Caleb said, there is this sense of these queer characters, especially in young adult books, better behave themselves because queer kids everywhere are watching, and you were setting examples left and right, and you were imprinting, and you were doing this, that. I'm like, by the time queer readers are finding YA books, a lot of their personalities are set, and they're going to want to see a little more, maybe some scarier dimensions to their personalities that are reflected.
Yeah, we're definitely not here to teach queer kids to be good queer kids, I would say. No easily digestible characters.
That's brilliant. Well, I was wondering, like, we've got onto the topic of protagonists and things, and I'm just really interested to know more about the villains and the monsters, the creatures, the cyborgs, the witches in your stories. And were there certain tropes or queer-coded stereotypes that you deliberately set out to play with or subvert through your characters and your storytelling?
Yeah, so in The Witch King, it takes place partially in our world, but partially in a fae society. where witches are actually sort of like unwanted abomination children of the Fae. And it's not a subtle allegory for like the experiences of queer kids, especially trans kids. So in the book, Fae have claws and fangs and wings and horns, and they're very clearly like visibly monstrous, like what you would consider monstrous. And witches lack a lot of those monstrous qualities. They look a lot more human. Their magic works in a different way. And it actually very directly runs counter to the way that transness is treated as monstrous in and of itself. That transitioning is seen as like mutilating or becoming less human, and that was absolutely intentional on my part.
So, with my 22 release monster, my protagonist was sacrificed to a monster. And obviously, she's not really cool with that. So she makes a deal with the monster. If he will help her get revenge on the people who sacrificed her, then she will find a way to let him into the town and just eat everyone. So what I did with that one was my main character, Latavia, she is openly gay. And it is on page. There is a romance. So what I wanted to do was really play with the idea of how she is kind of a villain, but also she has like a very personal, relatable reason. And so, kind of rambling, I guess, but what I really wanted was for people to understand her. Like, she's hurt, and like her reason for doing this is because she had no other option. And I feel like that is how a lot of queer kids feel sometimes. And so that's really what I wanted to do with that book, is just like create a person that people can identify with.
For me, the vampires in the Fell of Dark are pretty straightforward vampires. No shocking changes to how they are traditionally described, I think. But in my opinion, vampires have always been queer, and not just because the first like actual vampire novel, Carmilla, was a sapphic story, and people don't know that. But I mean, it really is like they are as tropes, as figures. There is something like this whole attraction of to the dark side and all that stuff. I think it just has gotten so watered down in all the popular retellings. You see like one straight vampire after another, and you think, you've got these beings that are immortal, they live for hundreds of years, and you're going to tell me that not a single one of them has a non-conforming gender identity or a non-conforming sexual identity. Like I call bull. But so for me, I think a lot of what it was is I wanted to pour queerness back into vampires, and we see some of that in True Blood. They did a good job, but even so, it's like I think a lot of it is still I think influenced by how straight people view sexuality as. But anyway, mostly what I wanted to do is I wanted to take the tropes of vampire novels and queer them. So I have a love triangle, but it's between three queer boys, and I wanted to write very specifically about what love triangles look like when all the sides do actually connect, and it isn't just one person with two kind of potential choices to make.
Yeah. So in Surrender Your Sons, there's no monsters; it's all humans. But so the villains in that, the thing it's a conversion therapy story. So the thing that was unavoidable was, and I chose to hit it straight on, was the idea of some of the people running the camp are former campers who are, it's this whole idea of hurt people, and you kind of go like taking the the joke that we really need to dispel, which is like, oh, anybody who's homophobic is closeted themselves, which is both harmful, not true, and also sometimes true. So, and I knew that there were going to be characters in this who were former campers of this. There was going to be this air of you can't trust anybody. And once you learn someone is gay or queer, that doesn't necessarily mean you can trust them. So with this, I wanted to take that trope, that damaging trope, and really go behind it and deepen it and see, okay, yeah, let's go behind the joke. It's, yeah, this guy is a successful graduate of the camp's program. We're going to basically see how, while he is still the major villain of the piece and it's not really redeemable, how his entire life has been caught in this cycle of abuse, and how really he is puppeteering so many people, but he himself is being puppeteered by a larger abusive heteronormative power structure. So that was something where the entire book is really breaking apart a trope while also unavoidably reinforcing it. But there are other villains as well.
So there are a lot of books with really soft sapphic relationships that I've read that I love. But personally, I really like a romance with a bit more kick to it. So in Gearbreakers, I have an enemies to lovers romantic arc between Eris, who's like a very cold-hearted soldier, and then on the opposite side, Sona, who's a cyborg mecha pilot. And I feel like cyborgs in media are usually like, they're very cold and unfeeling just because, they're robots, but not really, they're that hybrid line of it. So both girls come onto the page really filled with hatred that like does end up being softened by the other, by their romantic opposite. But I really wanted them to retain these roots in their basic characters, just like that hardness, just like more feral sapphics basically, but feral all on their own and not because of like any cybernetically enhanced parts.
Brilliant. So I know we've kind of touched a little bit already on writing a nuanced villain. I think you've all spoken a little bit about how you bring more depth of character to a villain. But I'd like to go back to a little bit and flesh it out, if I may, and discuss as well how vital the antagonist is to a narrative as a whole and a successful narrative.
Everything. There's no conflict without it. So I think like that is something where, the villain can a good villain can absolve a weaker story of a lot of sins. So I think if you nail your antagonist, your villain, whether it's society or whether it's an actual person, they're like extremely essential. And I think in writing that and getting that nuance in there, I think making it as formidable and oh my God, how are they going to defeat this as possible?
And also, going back to something that Adam said a minute ago about sort of examining how the villain got to the point that they're at. This is like maybe one of the gayest things I've ever said, but there's a Richard Zeichen quote from one of his poems that's like, imagine a story not of good against evil, but of need against need against need. And that's the way that I really like to approach writing my villains, is like, why is what they need at odds with the protagonist? And how did they get here? And I mentioned before that like my writing is like, it's very political and it's not subtle at all, in fact, that it's political. So my villains are usually metaphors for fascists, and very hard to find like sympathy for them and like find them redeemable. But you still have to understand how they got there and why they are the way that they are.
Yeah, I really agree with that. For me, I always try to like make them foils of each other. So hopefully if the reader can understand why the villain is doing what they're doing, they can understand why the protagonist needs to stop them, if that makes sense. And so what I like to do is just like make sure that the villain is strong enough to stand up to the story. So I personally don't like super world-ending stakes. I like the more personal ones. Like, I write middle grade, so sometimes, so like, why is this character bullying your main character? You know, something like that. And hopefully the reader can understand what the villain is going through, and then they can rally around the protagonist. Alternatively, if you're writing a villain origin story, like Monster kind of is a villain origin story. So you want the reader to not only understand the villain, but also, like, instead of their actions repulsing the reader, they need to like fascinate the reader and spark understanding in what they're doing.
I agree with that. I think that there's a misconception that writing, giving villains nuance and kind of layers and even a relatable backstory is the same thing as asking readers to sympathize with them or to see them as sympathetic characters. And that's so not true. I personally am not interested in stories where the villains are not complex. I find nothing relatable or realistic about that. I mean, yes, there are people who are just terrible people, but you know, like AG was saying, how did they get there? How did that happen to them? How did this person, even if you don't like them, even if you will never root for this person, even if you want them to get their comeuppance, it is still more interesting to know. I don't know, just to see them as human. I do think that we strip evil of its humanity at our own peril, because these are, I mean, that's the real deal. Like, the great villains of our time are human, and we, by pretending that these people are monsters, that there's something wrong with them, that they aren't human, that we have to depict them as less than human, it's a way of saying, well, that could never be me. And it could be all of us. So, you know, let's keep our villains complex, please.
Caleb, you're the villain in my life. I know that. I would say to Caleb, to your point, like, something I did, because I knew that I had this, as much as I had an ensemble of heroes, I had an ensemble of villains who were running this conversion therapy camp, and I didn't want to give a sympathetic backstory to everybody, because again, these are dreadful, dreadful people. And so in lieu of anything really sympathetic on one of the characters, Miss Manners, I decided instead that her relatability, or something that could draw a reader to her, was going to be that she was the cleverest person in the book. Like, she just was here to hurt queer kids. But the thing that gave her a little dimension was that she was smarter, faster, and anticipated the campers' moves more than any other of the villains. And so that kind of is the way, if you're writing, a villain that you don't necessarily feel comfortable giving a ton of like different, like, oh, the reason she's doing this is because fill in the blank. I just made her this extremely dangerous, clever person.
So, before 2000, queer-coded characters filled one of three primary roles in storytelling. Now, we've already just touched on the first, that of the villain, but the others are as a victim and as a punchline, respectively. And these have also shaped societal views of queer people. So what are the long-standing impacts of these two tropes in media, and how can they be undermined, adapted, and transformed?
I'll start. Just having queer-coded people placed in these tropes, it's definitely, of course, damaging. Like, you have this effect of having queer people as props, like means to an end for just other characters, which I think, it's like, that's storytelling, but it can be done where, like, it's not just queer characters that I'd be being used at these plot points. Like, you need to have you just need to have like a cast of characters that feels really real, and you need to distribute that diversity throughout anyone you have on the page, because there is, of course, going to be the implication that queer-coded villains, queer-coded villains, queer-coded victims, and punchlines. Like, that's what they're supposed to be, and that's it. Like, you need these fleshed out characters, and it's just gonna make like the whole story so much better.
Yeah, as a child of 90s thrillers, I am very familiar with the gay punchline person who's in the background. That's Caleb, you're not. Yeah, but we talk a lot. We text a lot about this. This is something where you can. That's where I saw my representation growing up, as in middle school and high school, was as these punchline characters, or gay characters who were completely agencyless, were in the movie for 2 minutes, ran and hid in a bathroom, were killed immediately. There was nothing interesting or fun. It was just pathetic. And so that to me was far more damaging to me than any queer villain I had seen in a Disney movie or whatever. And I think that's the most important part, especially writing now, is making sure that whatever your queer character is doing, that they have as much agency as humanly possible.
Yeah, and in terms of like adapting and transforming some of these tropes, I 100% agree with Adam. It was, anytime feminine men in particular were always portrayed, they were either the villain or they were the kind of sassy, sexless sidekick, always a joke or this kind of like creepy, suave, debonair, whatever, fastidious, prissy villain character. So for me, I always try to make my boy heroes noticeably feminine. I try to give them that, because that's like, I want to see those characters empowered. I want to see those readers empowered. I want them to see themselves as more than just somebody's best friend, or this, like, the joke character that gets killed right in the in the first 10 minutes or whatever it is. I want them to also see themselves as heroes, and even action heroes. I want them to be fighters and lovers and everything else.
Yeah, I mean, like, my main character in Surrender Your Sons, Connor, I knew this is a run through the jungle island adventure story, as well as a thriller. And that was something where I knew I didn't want to have the main character, this cis boy, be like, I'm just like you. I'm just a little different. Like, I wanted him to be legibly gay, as we say. Like, it was very, and I wanted him to be like, it's canon that he is bad at running, is bad at sports, has never hit a person, and then throw that person in the mix and tell that person to run all over this island and do this very adventurous jungle story, but it's not The Rock doing it. It's this kind of fae boy. So that to me was like, that raises the stakes, but it also is very subversive and affirming.
Something that I think is interesting about the punchline trope is that when we now see queer creators writing queer characters, so much of the in-humor in the community is like so irreverent and almost like self-deprecating, for better or worse, that it can make people outside of the community like kind of uncomfortable, because they don't understand our humor and like the way that we relate to each other. And I have run into people who, I would tell a joke that another queer person or another trans person would totally get, but if they're not queer, they're not trans, they're almost afraid to laugh, because it's like, I'm trying to be a good ally, and like, is it disrespectful if I laugh? So like, I think I love reading like the punchline trope turned on its head by queer authors who can take that humor and infuse it into their writing. Because I don't personally write my humor for people outside of the community. I write it inside, and that's my favorite thing about the jokes in my writing.
I couldn't agree more. Like, that's how we process trauma. It's how a lot of us process trauma. And I'll tell you, like, that the humor in Surrender Your Sons was the #1 hurdle to it being bought on submission. It was the #1 feedback that came back. People were very freaked out, either by it or liked it, but had no clue how to sell it to somebody who would also be freaked out by it. It was the #1 problem. And it was the #1 thing I refused to get rid of.
I wanted to talk a little bit about turning the victim trope on its head. To me, I feel like it is very disrespectful, especially in like 80s slashers, like the gay person will never live, like ever. So, but I also feel like there's a little bit of truth in that in the time. So to me, I feel like it's disingenuous to say that you should never have a queer character who is a victim of something, because queer characters and queer people are often victims of many different things, like microaggressions, or even now, like today's world is not exactly a safe place to be. It is safer than it has been, but I feel like we should not ignore the danger that comes with being queer in today's society. And so what I've tried to do in my own work is, yes, some of my characters are queer and they are victims of horrible things, like my main character in Monster, where she was attacked and brutalized and tied to an altar to be eaten by a monster. But also she overcomes that, and we get to see her not only as a victim, but also like surviving that attack and being stronger, not because of it, but in spite of it, and living her life after that. And I feel like a lot of people should be able to relate to that.
So, I have personally always loved fantasy, science fiction, horror, thrillers, and I will admit that I quite often sympathise with the monster of the story and root for them. Frankenstein's creature is probably one of my favourites. Do you have a favourite literary monster, and why that monster?
Yeah, I'll go first. Hyde from Jekyll and Hyde. Let's just look at this through like a trans lens for a second. I wonder why like tiny baby me from a conservative small town would have looked at this polished, respectable doctor who was hiding this monstrous secret double identity and been like, this has awakened something in me.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I should say this, but like the witch in Hansel and Gretel, like I'm not rooting for her, but I appreciate her style with like the house of candy in the middle of the woods for like a reason that's never explained in any of the adaptations I've read. And then how she kind of makes like the punishment fit the crime for the kids. Like it's a theme that I feel like I have to respect.
I always liked Princess Langwidere from Return to Oz. She's the one with the gallery of heads that she swaps out. And there was something about that, something about this whole choosing your whole entire appearance on a daily basis to suit your mood, which I think like queer reinvention is such a real thing. And it was like just seeing that, like I was like that would be so cool. To have like 100 different heads and you can just like pop one on.
My answer is not as intelligent, but I just love all the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park. Like, they definitely deserve to get eaten. We love you guys, sapphic queens, eating all of the people. They're the greatest.
I love that.
I'm cracking up. I love that. I don't know if it's like a specific like book specifically, but the werewolf story has always spoken to me. It's the metaphor, probably second only to vampire with that, and doesn't usually get as much like queerness there. But it's something where I think a lot of different folks can imprint like their queer story onto that, and specifically my own thing that I've like connected to with that is this whole this duality, kind of like Jekyll and Hyde story, where there is like yeah, I'm just this little sweetie pie in the family, and it doesn't matter how, like, nice and respectable and assimilated you are. Every once in a while, this is gonna come out, and this is something where and there is this like war to be of yeah, like once a month this like monster thing happens to me, but I'm really more about like the other 29 days. But it's also like I think the werewolf story really is not about like, oh, it's not you're one or the other. It's like this is all you. This is all one you. So I always thought that was just such a interesting story that it's just a wonderful thing you can keep going back to the well on.
So the word monstrous derives from Latin, monere to warn and demonstrare to show or make visible. So the idea of visibility is kind of built into the word itself, and so in fact is the idea of being in some way different and inferior. There is therefore a clear parallel with queerness, as we've spoken about, and queer-coded monsters often function as the intersection between literal monstrosity and kind of allegorical monstrosity. In what ways do you think queer monstrousness can be reclaimed through literature and storytelling?
All right. So I think that a lot of queerness gets caught up in media in respectability politics. I think that our experiences are often really sanitized to be presented in a way that is most easily digestible or most palatable to the broadest audience. And I do think, like, yes, queerness is joyful and it is triumphant, and it is beautiful in a lot of ways, but we also don't exist to be inspiration porn for straight people. And I think that a lot of times our stories are used in that way. So as far as queer monstrousness being reclaimed, I think that we should be allowed to, and we are seeing more of recently, exploring how queerness is also angry and it's full of grief and it can be ugly and hard to swallow and good. Like sometimes the things that happen to us are hard to swallow. Sometimes we are made uncomfortable, and so maybe readers should also sometimes be made uncomfortable. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, off of that, I completely co-sign all of that, and I think slightly to piggyback, I think our role can be to. This is gonna sound bad, but whatever. It is to disrupt the home, and I think a lot of times that's seen as a negative, like because a lot of queer people do come from homes that do get broken sometimes over this, but sometimes those homes need to be broken, and I think every home deserves to have this challenge put to them of, is your love unconditional? Because I think a lot of people if they have complete heteronormativity within their own home, don't get this challenge put to them, so they never have to find out exactly how strong those bonds are. They never have to have that challenge put to them. And that is something that I think, not that our role is to be this lesson for everybody, but I do think it is to disrupt what people think of as a home. I think it is to constantly say, this is not the only thing that's out there. And to have that, disruption, not to speak of this in like, like tech industry terms, like it's very disruptive. It's a good disruption for the home, but it is. I think a lot of homes need to be shaken up, and they need to really be put to that test.
So, moving on to the next question. In his autoethnographical essay, Becoming Ever More Monstrous, Feeling Transgender in Between Us, Sonny Nodsmarken proclaims monstrosity a tool of resistance and reconnection that can help build connections across difference. If we are monsters, then we are monsters together. Found family is a feature of books by many of us on this panel. Can you speak a little to the significance of found family in relation to monsterhood and queer identities?
You know, actually, it's interesting because I prior to The Fall of Dark, I wrote a book that was all about found family. It was not a horror story. It wasn't about monsters. Well, it was human monsters, but it was about found family. And then I wrote a book about vampires, where these are people who they start as humans and then they become monsters, and they sort of form new families out of necessity. And there is something so I don't know. It's a very poetic metaphor for the queer condition, or for what it is for a lot of people, where you lose your connection to. Thank God it's less so now than it once was, but many queer people lose that connection, and it is very infrequent that queer people are born into their communities or are raised by people in their communities. And found family is essential. Our histories are not taught in schools, and they are rarely passed down by word of mouth. And in fact, very often they are deliberately buried by schools. And our historical figures are lied about, and their contributions are either hidden or they are attributed to somebody else or to some other aspect of their identity. And so finding your community, finding people who will share all this with you, who will understand these things about you innately, is so valuable. And it does correlate to some of these monster stories with werewolves and vampires in particular, who are, like as Adam pointed out, werewolves who are human most of the time, but not all the time. And they're pack animals, and vampires are often depicted as being sort of pack creatures as well. And yeah, so there is a lot of metaphor there, and a lot to play with. And I think that it's just it's a different way to explore found family than writing about it just as sort of seeking the camaraderie of your sort of kin. It's not blood, but with monsters, it's like I don't know. It allows you to explore some darker aspects of what that means.
Yeah, Caleb, we also, talking about, the interruption of passing down history, we also lost an entire generation. A lot of that knowledge just gone. And so that, I think, is a trauma that is still with us and is ongoing and will be felt by generations that are not even born yet. And that's something where there is this very recent wrong that has not been made right, because there's a lot of rage built into that. And so that's something where, back to my disruption thing, I just think this is what society is brought. So it will, again, that's usually, a lot of times these monster stories are society did a thing thinking they could just skip away and be fine, but oh no, there were side effects. And now we're being attacked by our consequences, and we don't like that. So it's also very queer.
Yeah, the found family trope, definitely my favorite. Let's just say it. I definitely saturated it in Gear Breakers. I have these queer kids who find each other, and they're each monstrous in their own ways, just because of like what they've been forced to do in this war that's going on. But it's the idea of like you can be whatever you are, and like we are going to be still together. And I think that comfort of this trope is particularly good for queer readers who perhaps like are picking up these stories with found family from like a place in their life where they're not accepted for who they are. Like for me, like it just like helps. For me, like it helps like set the standard almost, but also like set the hope that like this is like something that's, because it's in media, it has to be out there somewhere. It doesn't just, the idea doesn't just come from nowhere. It's like, the light at the end of the tunnel. It's just like everything, like there is a community out there. I feel like it helps to solidify.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. especially the hopeful part. And there's so many different ways that you can play with found family too. Like for my YA that's coming out in August, Bad Witch Burning, that one is not queer. She just has like a lot going on with zombies and stuff. So, you know, but in that one, she has a bad parent. And so her found family is through her friendships and through her friend's mother and her guidance counselor. So family can look like anything. It can be friends, it can be other adults in your life, it can be someone younger than you that needs a mentor. Like I just feel like it's the perfect trope because you can write it in a way that it is accessible to anyone in any situation.
And I think to just kind of like go off of what everybody has already kind of touched on, like I think it's a deeply familiar sort of queer yearning to want to be seen at your most authentic, and still be loved, not in spite of who you are, but because of who you are. I think that something that a lot of queer people run into with our families of origin is being accepted and loved in spite of our identities. And that can often be like the best case scenario for a lot of people. So I think like this sense of wanting to find people who celebrate those parts of you, and who don't feel like they have to accept you or tolerate you is really, really important. And that's why found family is so big in queer communities.
So, in a letter to my mother that she will never read, author and poet Ocean Vuong wrote, "To be a monster is to be a hybrid signal, a lighthouse, both shelter and warning at once. Vampires, werewolves, witches, zombies, machines, cyborgs, and AI are all beings that embody dualism. They are in part human and yet also distinctly other. Does this duality come into your writing of queer-coded or overtly queer characters, especially those who are themselves villains or who are partly monstrous or machine? And if so, do you treat this duality as a source of power, a hindrance, or both?"
So Sona again is my protagonist in Gear Breakers, or one of them, and she is a cyborg mecha pilot. And initially, like, she wakes up after the modding surgery, and she has this total crisis of humanity because she's like, I don't know, like, why I did this to myself. Like, now I'm a weapon, and they're just gonna use me. But I use queerness in Gear Breakers, kind of to heal that in her, because she meets Eris, and it's kind of like, oh, like this, like what I feel for Eris, like that is what like makes me human. Like no matter like what I'm carrying around with me or like what I could be used for, like this is what feels real. And so definitely like, and then she can of course like use that part of herself because it's like no longer a crisis because she's gay. And so I definitely use it as a that duality is like a source of power, but it's definitely like something she has to work for. And that path involves being her truest self and being her softest self.
Yeah, so in The Witch King, the main character, Wyatt, is a witch in a fae society, and I had kind of touched on earlier about how witches in this world, they don't look like the fae, they look a lot more human. Their power doesn't act like fae power does. And he's othered, and he's ostracized, and he's attacked. And he ends up running off into the human world for a period of time. And the whole story is really about whether he will stay in this kingdom, where he is betrothed to the Fae Prince in a marriage that nobody wants except the prince, or if he will run back to the human world. And there is this sort of pull between feeling like he doesn't belong in either place. He's not one of the Fae. He's not a human, and witches are completely disenfranchised. So there is nowhere that is designed for him. There's nowhere that he feels like he can really be himself and have power. But then, like, maybe he comes into it and, like, weaponizes it or something. I know you're going to have to buy the book and find
out. In terms of dualism, I mean, obviously, like I mentioned earlier that, of course, vampires are inherently dualistic. But something that I really wanted to explore with The Fell of Dark is a lot of queer men find that they want to be young and beautiful forever. That is something that plagues queer men just in general. And so I wanted to write about what would happen if that wish came true, if you could have that, and what that means, and whether or not that's actually a good thing to not ever get older and to sort of, I don't know. So I tried to use the vampires as a means of exploring that aspect of queer identity.
Caleb, is the answer that it would be great? Is that the...
all your dreams come
awesome.
true, Adam.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
It would just solve all your problems. Okay, I'm doing that again.
In many ways, dismantling the concept of queer monstrosity and the duality of the queer machine can come down to two options: denying monstrosity and attempting assimilation, or embracing monstrosity and instigating revolution against the system. Which path offers the most capacity for change? If we choose assimilation, do we self-sabotage any attempt to tear down the system from within?
I think that there's a perceived safety in assimilation. But I think that safety is always conditional, and it can be taken away at any time. Personally, I decided a long time ago that I would embrace being a monster because, like, cis normativity did this, and now I am their problem. I have no interest in assimilating.
Listen, I'm recording in a house in the suburbs with my husband, so I can't really be like, no assimilation, none, like, so. But I think there is a power in resisting that assimilation. I think resisting assimilation has to be respected more than supporting it, because I think the river will always flow in the direction of assimilation. So I don't think assimilation needs a PR team. So I think definitely, like, if there's like, yeah, let's highlight the benefits to remaining a big old monster. I am all for that, and so that's why I try to do that through my work, and then in my own little ways in this little neighborhood, which I'm on the Facebook group of the HOA. So in my own little ways, I will be resisting there.
Well, I definitely, I came of age at a time when queer people were being encouraged to assimilate, and we're encouraging each other to assimilate. In fact, people who did not or could not were blamed for perpetuating homophobia. We're the ones setting the movement back because we're living up to the stereotypes that straight people have for us. And that messed me up. Like, it really messed me up. It took a long time for me to, oh my gosh, I remember I used to make these little movies with my brother, and we'd like write little scripts, and I tried to write like a horror movie once, and I was like watching some of the footage back, and I just saw myself I was walking down a hallway, and I was so depressed because I was like, I walked gay. I could see that I was gay just from the way that I walked, and it was so, I just felt so utterly demoralized because I thought, it's on me. I can't get away from it. I can't even walk like a normal person. And what a horrible way to feel about yourself, that your basic physicality is a prison. It's something that it's marking you out, and that this justifies people mistreating you and being horrible to you. it took me so long to realize that I love that about myself. I love this part of myself, and I love every aspect of it. I tried so hard to fit in, to be, to unclockable as a gay person. Because the ideal when I was a teenager, it was, if anyone can tell you're gay, then you're doing it wrong. And now I'm like, I love being gay. I love being noticeably gay. I love that. I've come to love that about myself. I've come to love that in other people. I've come to find that attractive. All of these things that, for me, like that, just that little bit of self-acceptance is very subversive. It's very revolutionary. So yeah, no, down with assimilation, like no to assimilation. And we absolutely shouldn't be encouraging young people to think less of themselves for any way that they don't fit in with the norm, because what is normal except for just stuff that's common? Be uncommon, be extraordinary.
Yeah, the pride discourse is starting again, of what we should allow at Pride, and then there's a weird sort of, the think of the children way of speaking has sort of mutated and assimilated in its own way into our own community. I do think there is something going on where people kind of think like, oh, well, there's kids at Pride and you want to set a great example, so please make sure you're on your best behavior, or fill in the blank, or whatever. And it's it's very disheartening, because Caleb, like you said, kind of coming out in the early 2000s, the only way we were starting to get visibility, and the only pathway out was through strict assimilation, and even then it was a casino. So yeah, that's had lasting impacts, and I think we should just be fighting that as much as possible, because some people may want it, but make sure it's something you want, and not everything around you is telling you want.
I don't know. This one is really tough for me, because to me, I feel like some people have to assimilate, or they feel like they have to. Safety is always a concern. And I live in Alabama, so it's not great down here. So I feel like for anyone who feels bad that they can't do more, I like what Adam said about the little resistances. If you can't be out, buy queer books, or recommend them to family, or watch queer media and support, something like that. If you feel like, I don't want to call it like a battle or whatever, but in the march for progress, if you feel like you're not doing enough, as long as you're doing what you can, I feel like you have nothing to be ashamed about, or nothing to feel bad. Obviously, I would love for everyone to just come out and be monsters everywhere. That'd be great. But it's just not the reality that we have right now. And so, I don't know. This is a tough question for me. I've been thinking about it the entire time. But go ahead.
I think that's a really, really good point. That there is an element of privilege to being able to be visible and not feel like you have to hide parts of yourself. I live in Brooklyn right now, and I feel very safe walking down the street, but I grew up in the deep, deep South. And it's different. And I think, obviously, individual safety is more important than sending a message.
And I agree with that. I also think that there is, because we're also touching on not just assimilation, but the closet and the function of the closet, and how there is self-preservation, there is protection. I don't think of that as assimilation. I think of assimilation as you are out and queer, and you are saying, trying to dictate what appropriate queer behavior is, as opposed to making decisions for yourself based on your needs and on your personal safety.
Yeah, it's something where, just this last year, I lived in West Hollywood for 20 years, and then now I live in the North Carolina suburbs, so I'm like purple state realness here. So it's good, you know, but it's also, you know, it's a shift even from the fact that maybe there's not outright hostility. There is just unnoticeable depletion of queerness. It's just you go from this very, very heavy, you know, queer space where it's all visible to you're not quite sure. And, you know, even in these, you know, in these meccas, you're never quite sure. And I think the thing is, and this was something that plays very strongly into Surrender Your Sons, my book, was my main character is basically pressured by his boyfriend to come out because he wants this really public relationship. And the main character is not ready, but he really, really wants to make his boyfriend happy. And he knows that that's what he wants, but he has not taken into account the nightmare that's going to unfold for him the moment he does that. And his boyfriend doesn't really know any better because he kind of grew up in this bubble where, like, you know, he was always accepted and, you know, he was out really early. And so to him, it was like, yeah, why would you be in the closet when you don't need to be? And did not take my main character's safety and everything into account. And it kind of begins the story. And the whole idea behind that was that Connor, while he's completely closeted and in this place where you have to stay closeted or else, it was very important to me that it's first person, so it's important that he is still him. And that's I think the sort of underlying message there is that you can be closeted and you are still you. So even if you are assimilated for your own safety everywhere else outside your home, if you know you're you can be unassimilated in your own home. And if that's what you need to do, that's what you need to do. So I think that, again, yeah, it's a really personal question.
Yeah, and I think, like what you said about in your own home, that's where the found family kind of comes in. Mm-hmm. Like this, you can be yourself around the people that you feel comfortable with.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. If there isn't anything else, I will move on to our next question. So, some argue that queer coding and queer baiting, the marketing technique of hinting at but not actually depicting LGBTQIA+ representation, is better than no representation at all. And also that making villains or monsters explicitly queer can cause more harm to the LGBTQIA+ community and their acceptance in broader society. What do you say to those arguments?
I don't know who's saying queer coding, queer baiting are good marketing techniques, but I don't think they're queer because I hate that. That's like, it's just like so, I feel like it's so damaging because it's definitely like I don't know, just like reeks of capitalism for one, but like just, there's also, feels like there's a morality thing where like you are, I don't know. It just feels like that just feels very wrong to me. And on the other side, like if you make like the villain explicitly clear, like we've already gone over this kind of where it's like you just have to make like their queerness like not twined with whatever evil stuff is going on. But it's definitely like the solution is not to like dilute it or keep it on one side of whatever morality is going on in the story. Like you just have to have your cast. You just have to have a good solid cast of characters, and you know, it's okay like if like a character is queer coded just because like it's in their it's just like in their character that they don't use labels or that they are going to be less explicit about it. But definitely, I was like, that was a whole rant, but like definitely no to queer coding and baiting. I'm like, I don't budge on it.
Yeah, I'm so tired of queer baiting and coding. I'm just very tired. I'm a very tired media consumer right now. Because we are at this precipice where, you know, we're especially young adult. I say this to everybody who's a creative, you know, who is not really well versed in young adult lit. I'm just like, YA is the tip of the spear on that right now by a long shot, because you go to you watch movies or TV or other stuff. I think you're seeing how employing a lot of queer creators and giving them free rein to write the queer stories that they would like to do. You're seeing how far you can go. You're seeing the ocean of untold stories that are just sitting there and have been sitting there forever, that a lot of probably film and TV are ignoring. And I say this as a huge Marvel stan. I think Marvel's at this very, very, a precipice place where a lot of, because again, I think a lot of, I'm not to pick on Marvel, there's a lot of people who do this, but they know that they're going to get the queer dollars, whether they confirm that on screen or not. And so to get the most money possible, they do not. It is something that it is a financial plan that has worked for them so far. But I do not know how much longer that's going to be so. And it seems by all accounts that they are making steps to do that. I mean, even it's so silly, but even watching WandaVision and seeing Wanda's twins who do eventually become these very important queer characters in the canon, just knowing that they exist, even if they were like 10 years old, and this was an extremely emotional moment because it was like, are they even doing this? Are they going to do this? And they still might. So I think that's something where its time has come to knock that off. And yeah, I think the next few years are going to be very, very important for that.
Yeah, society has absolutely progressed beyond the need for queer baiting. I watched so many terrible television shows as like a teenager and an early 20-something because they would hint at these little like bits of queer content and it would never come to fruition. And I just, every week I would tune in and I would watch people I did not like doing things that didn't make any sense because I was like, I just want those two boys to kiss. That's all I want, just once. Like it can even be like one of those like terrible like closed mouth, like 2 seconds like closed mouth kiss in a sweeps week stunt episode. I was like, that's what I had to look forward to. And no, we absolutely don't need it anymore. It's not good. It doesn't send a good message. It's just like, who is it there for, except for very rich people who are sort of rubber stamping these huge projects to say, like this will rope in a few more people. We don't have to actually do anything. We don't have to actually put our money where our mouths are. We don't have to actually make a difference for this community. We just put out some bait and reel them in.
Shades of the cheerleader's friend from Heroes. That was like one of the worst. Like, because I knew that that everybody behind the scenes was trying to make that happen. So that ended up being like they laid all the tracks as if that was going to be like confirmed. And this is a F-list character that was not an important character, and still the mechanisms that had to spin in order to like keep that kid closeted was.
I kind of want to address like the argument that making queer characters explicitly like monstrous or villainous does more harm than good. I think that this is where you get back into this idea of like sanitizing queer stories and getting things wrapped up in respectability politics. Like for so long, that was the only representation that we had, and it was bad representation, but it was all that we had to look at. And also, like, queer people have been hurt, and like, there's a lot of anger, and it does feel like saying it when people say like, oh, you can't write stories about like bad people who are queer because like it makes us all look bad. It feels like saying that we're not allowed to have an answer. We're not allowed to respond to what has been done to us already. That doesn't feel fair to me.
It's also like saying we can't be human beings. We have to be these angelic aliens. It's a weirdly, I find it weirdly dehumanizing even more.
Yeah, I'm just gonna agree with everyone. But also, it's very interesting how publishing in general responds to this. Just because I know like TV is pretty far behind, but like Adam said, like YA is on the cusp of that change. And I know like I'm a Black woman, so what I've been struggling with is publishing only wants like Black pain books. So if Black people are not in pain, they don't want to buy it. And I wonder if that's kind of the same thing that's happening here. Like if queer people are not, cherubs sitting on their little fountains and, have their little angel wings, then they don't want them. And I've seen a little bit of a change with as far as like I'm a Black person and I was able to write. They did pay me for my book about a giant snake and two lesbians. So I mean, I'm glad, um, but I have not seen that in a lot of other. I watch the deal announcements and I'm trying to find some, but progress is slow. It's especially in publishing. So,
I mean, anecdotally, I will say I got paid a whole lot more for my rom-com than I did for my thrillers. So it is kind of, yeah, I don't know. And I think it's about kind of like making sure even in a sweeter story that there are like levels and layers to that. But it really is going to be about what people are buying. I think viewers right now can really, I mean, the way you can help that is to make sure you are buying. If you want to see more of these dimensionalities supported, there's one way, and that's request it at your library and buy the book.
Well, then what I really want to ask is everybody to pitch either your book or you can pitch somebody else's if you like as a must read for anybody who is interested in the subjects that we've been talking. So villains, monsters, machines, and the history of queer coding.
All right. Well, I have to pitch my book. I do have bills to pay. So yeah, like I said, The Witch King is out by the time this video goes up. It is my debut. Buy it. It's gay and it's trans and it's actually really funny. And it's about monsters and cool magic systems, but like also secretly about fighting police corruption and really needing to go to therapy. So like, but there is another book that I want to mention. It's coming out next year in the summer of 2022. It's called Hell Followed Us. It's by Andrew Joseph White. Please look it up, add it on Goodreads. It's a post-apocalyptic YA religious body horror. It has a trans mask main character. And I genuinely believe that this book examines the monstrousness of transness in a way that nothing I've ever seen before has done. And it's Andrew's debut, and he is just a delight of a person. So please buy both of our books.
I'll go. So again, Gearbreakers out in June, June 29th, late June. So just has like, you have your mechas and you have your enemies to lovers, sapphic arcs, and they tattoo each other as a form of affection. Tons of found family. Just like I get a kick out of it. I think people will too if you're needing more of the action in your queer sci-fi. And another book I would definitely suggest if people are looking for more science fiction fantasy blend for the queer representation in YA is Crier's War by Nina Varela. That's also enemies to lovers. It's just really soft. I totally recommend.
I will also pitch my book again, The Fell of Dark. It is about a lovable gay goofball who has to save the world from the apocalypse. It has a genuine love triangle between three queer boys, and I tried to explore exactly what, like, kind of like a realistic version of what that looks like, and how those emotional entanglements manifest within the queer community. But Overall, mostly, I like to call it it's Simon versus the Vampire Agenda. It's just it's fun and it's funny and hopefully it's a little spooky. So
Okay, I'll go next. So I'm gonna pitch 3 books, and I'm just kidding. So I have my YA Monster. That one comes out in 2022, and that one is it's got everything. It's got lesbians. It's got a giant snake. It's got murder. It's got 2 dogs, not 1 but 2. I mean, it's just got everything you want in a book. But it also examines what it means to be a monster, what it means to be a human, and how far one girl is willing to go to get revenge. And then I also have my middle grade. It's called Meow or Never. Very cute. That one has no monsters at all, but it is sapphic. It's very adorable. And then my YA that comes out in August is Bad Witch Burning. And that one is actually all about monsters. My main character is a monster. She is a demon. And just like in personality, like she's like a person, but like she's a demon. So if you are interested in that as well. But that's all I have, I promise.
So I will pitch my book, which is already out, Surrender Your Sons. I've talked a lot about it already here on this show, but yeah, you can go pick it up. It is a conversion therapy camp thriller, but it is all steeped in hope and heart and good friends. And spoiler alert, they are victorious. I was very, very clear that this is a queer victory book. So yeah, there's, heed the content warnings at the beginning of the book, but otherwise have a blast. It is wish fulfillment, revenge kind of goodness, which I really like. And I also do want to mention another great book you should check out, which you can't pre-order yet, is my friend Terry Benton's book Blood Debts, which is coming out in winter 2023 from Tor Teen. He is a marvelous human being. He describes it as Dynasty with magic. And if you are really, really wanting to see more Black gay boys in fantasy YA lit, this is the book for you. So add it to your Goodreads. Keep your eye on it. Terry Benton's Blood Debts.
Wonderful. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody for joining me. So thank you to HE, to Caleb, to Jessica, to Adam, to Zoe. This has been an amazing discussion. Just so many good points, so many ideas, and so many great book recommendations. All of our shelves. I am Rosie. I like to talk about books, particularly the monstrous kind of books. And if you want to keep in contact with everybody, you can come find me on TikTok and Instagram as @MarriedChild. I want to thank everybody for joining us today at Pride Book Fest 2021.